the Jack Kirby Museum, history of Jack Kirby, loosely based on the comics Apocalypse show that was in LA last year, except we have three people who shall start introducing yourself.
Okay, my name is Bruce Simon. I grew up in Los Angeles and was lucky enough to have met and known Jack Kirby a bit, not as well as my friend Steve Sherman, who worked with Jack and was his assistant for many, many years and just about a member of the family.
Yeah, I started with Jack in 1970 on the New Gods and Forever People and all the DC work, and I worked with him until he left DC. And then after that, we did some independent stuff.
And I'm Mark Badger, and I'm just a comic book artist who grew up on Jack's comics. I found some, when my mom moved out of her house, I found some old sketchbooks from elementary school, and there was copies of Jack Kirby in them. And recently I just finished adapting Julius Caesar, which was based on Jack's work. And so then I was working on Julius Caesar, I was copying Jack's work every day. So I was doing a sort of a practice called Daily Kirby.
Right. And before we start, does everybody know who Jack Kirby is? Pretty much?
We see, raise your hands if you don't know who
Yeah,
Jack is.
Okay.
We'll talk.
Okay.
We'll talk about it. Jack was born 99 years ago on the Lower East Side of New York, which looked exactly like this in those days. This is from Street Code, which is his only autobiographical story.
Yes, it was actually, it's probably his last story. The last
No, it
story,
wasn't.
pretty much, yes, he drew it in '85. That's pretty late for him.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Well, he
And
died
it's his only
in the
straight autobiographical story, and this is like the street he grew up on in the Lower East Side of New York. And I'll talk about it a little bit. He grew up on the Lower East Side, and it was a very tough environment. You know, there were street gangs back then where every block had its own gang, and if you went on somebody else's block, you
Got your block knocked off.
you got your block knocked off. And so it was a tough environment. And he was fortunate enough to join what would be analogous to a YMCA or a boys club back then called the Boys Republic, which helped kids get off the street and, you know, maybe learn a few things. And that's where he started doing his cartoons for the group newspaper and such. And this is more of the story, Street Code. And yeah, you can see the kind of tough environment he grew up into.
And this is also what Jack's pencils look like at this stage. Most of what you'll see,
Oh, there he is.
here's the guy drawing himself, cranking away. Was he still smoking when you guys were working?
Oh,
for
yeah.
him?
Oh, yes. He'd switch off between a pipe or a cigar. He kind of gave up the cigars and just stuck to a pipe until he got throat cancer, and then he stopped the pipe.
Yeah.
So, Jack, he's basically one of the founders of comics. They created, Simon and Kirby was the first team that he worked as a guy he worked with, right?
Joe
Right.
Simon.
Um,
They created Captain America for Marvel, which became an incredible hit. Sold over a million copies, and became incredibly popular. And then went on to create characters for other companies. This is actually post-war. He did this for Harvey Comics, and this is an example of some of the first double-page spread artwork in the comic books.
This is from the 50s where he's continuing to do the double-page spread. Comics weren't limited to superheroes in those days, and I mean, Jack and Joe Simon were probably, they started with the superheroes. After the war, they did romance, right?
Right.
And they did westerns.
And war comics. They invented romance comics, which is actually one of the biggest hits in the history of comics. You know, they did romance comics for many years. Those were incredibly large sellers. They probably had their heart more in a comic like This Boy's Ranch, which is like, it's almost like the equivalent of seeing a bar fight in one of the classic movie westerns where all these things are going on. and it's incredible work. It was not as popular as the romance work, though.
You can already, when you start looking at this, Jack didn't stop at the corners of the pages, and he didn't compose pictures the same way. Our other artist did, where he just put the center of the interest in the middle, but he's already putting things in all the corners, going off the page, coming out at you. He's trying to make the action as jam-packed on the page as you can get, and that continues throughout his whole life of making these pages that just push the space to the foreground. Like almost everybody in the America in the 40s, he ended up in the military.
You want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, he, just about the time he and Joe Simon were doing real well at DC, the war came along, and just about every artist got drafted. Most of them ended up in the States, working in graphics and things like that. Jack was one of the few that got shipped overseas in the infantry, and he served under General Patton. He landed in France just after D-Day, not too long afterwards. And
He was in the Battle of the Bulge.
Battle of the Bulge. He was a scout, basically. What he would do is he would go into the villages and towns to check out where the Germans were, and then kind of draw a little map, come back, let everybody know what was going on.
Incredibly dangerous work. It probably, I think he would say that it was the most seminal event in his life, being in the war. It affected his outlook and his storytelling, and he liked nothing better for the rest of his life to talk about his experiences. It was really a profound effect on him. And this is from
This is from the 50s.
Yeah.
This is a war story from that time period.
yeah, and they're very authoritative because he was there.
And you can see with this, this is a, Jack, he hasn't quite taken that, the Western where he was filling out the page. He's filling out the page, but he's still looking at the world as a whole scene. Jack was probably inked this, right?
Probably.
And there's this loose, scratchy kind of drawing that comes out of Milton Caniff, who drew Steve Canyon and Terry and the Pirates. And all comic book artists looked at strips as the starting point. And at this time period, the dream was to get your daily strip in the newspaper, because that's where the big bucks were. And the guys who did the newspaper strips were famous as movie stars.
Sorry.
And Steve's distracting us from our brilliant talk.
Yeah. It's true, because comic books, one thing about comic books, as opposed to newspaper strips where you could theoretically make an excellent living and be as famous as a movie star, comic books are mostly produced as piecework. And like in a factory setting where one person writes it, one person does the pencil drawings, they hand it off to the next person to do the lettering, and the next person doing the inks, hand it off to somebody else to do the coloring, and it was like an assembly line situation where you would get like $10 to pencil a page, and the guy who inks it gets $8, and the letterer gets $2, and the colorist gets $1, and at the end, the company has a page that was assembled by like 5 or 6 people, which meant that everybody had to work as fast as they can for not a lot of money. And what they created belonged to the company, not them.
And this is sort of an example of how Jack's war experience went all through his life, because this is in the 70s.
Yes.
From a strip called The Losers, where Jack went to DC and from Marvel after his period in the Fantastic Four, and he just picked up these characters and took them and started taking his war stories and putting them into this comic at this stage, even late in his life. He would have been how old was he in the 70s?
He was in his very late 50s. Late 50s, early 60s.
So all through his period, he did war comics. I mean, he was the guy who created Did he create Sergeant Fury?
He sure
I
did.
mean,
Yep.
so Samuel Jackson was actually one of the characters that Jack created. Here's, as we were talking about, one of the romance pages.
And yeah, for a guy who was famous for doing like wild action, he could do human interactions and relationship stuff, quiet stuff where people are just talking and relating to each other. He could do that as well or better than anybody. They're very powerful stories too. He wrote a lot of these stories, and for romance comics, they actually have a lot of depth and feeling to them. Oh, back to the westerns.
And then this is westerns in the early 60s.
Yeah.
Just as Marvel's getting started.
This is right before the time that they started doing the superheroes. He was doing mostly Western war and romance comics for Marvel, and monster comics.
And you can see where all the action adventure, this is kind of Jack's just cranking out pages, and he's just drawing all the scene, all as one scene here. And then we start getting into, he takes off.
Right, so they brought back Captain America, who kind of tapered off at the 40s, and brought him back in the 60s and became incredibly popular again. Boom. Great stuff.
And you can see that Jack's style sort of changes. It gets more detailed, and that was because he was very aware of other media. He was aware of television and movies, and he saw how, TV was going and movies and things like that. So he would always be working on his style to try and keep up with that, to compete.
Did he ever talk about how fast he had to draw pages? And did that affect his style at all with the fact that he was doing 4 pages a day?
No, he just sort of sat down and started doing the story, and he knew he had to get so many by the end of the week. So whether he did 4 in one day, 3 the next, or sometimes maybe just 2, he just knew by the end of the week he had to have so many pages, so he would.
And once in a while, he would wind up with a couple extra,
pages.
or wind up with a couple short, because he didn't do the stories like from page 1 to page 20. He would kind of start in the middle and work his way to both ends, depending on, and then assemble it together at the end. It's a very interesting way of working.
Because he would do sequences. So if he would start, let's see, a certain sequence that took 4 pages, he'd do that, and then he'd say, okay, now I'd go back to the splash page. Usually he'd do the splash page at the end, because that was just, just 1 page, so he would kind of save that.
So he'd save the beginning of the whole story when you say splash page?
Yeah.
You mean like
Like
he would do splash pages inside of the comics too, where almost nobody else did.
Yeah, full page panels, right. Bless you.
Pages like this. Steranko sort of picked some of these up from Jack, but nobody had pages like this.
Just furious action. Oh,
Hayworth just wants to talk to you.
He does. He probably wonders where I am.
okay. He should have come to the panel.
And you can see this is a variation on that Western fight scene that we showed you, where Jack, a lot of his themes sort of kept revolving around and back and forth. Obviously fight scenes with the comics he was doing were important. Here's something, you can go through and you can find any modern comic. If you go to a comic book store today, you will not find one cover that's as exciting as this. And you won't find one cover with a foreground as dynamic and as powerful as that. It's just saying, I'm going to just stick a big hand in the foreground so you have something going on.
Well, people knew that was the character of Thor and his hammer. You didn't actually have to show him. You had to show. It's like you're looking at this character, this creature from his point of view, and it's stunning. People wouldn't do that today because they'd say, "Well, who's the star of this
Whose hand does this comic belong to?" And here's it's a Thor page from sort of the end of his run on Thor. You can begin to see that in the first panel, just all the pattern that he's been putting in. And Jack wasn't drawing details like Star Wars detail, but he was drawing pattern. Just because I think, because it's simpler and easier to draw than figure out all the Star Wars detail, of actually drawing things. So his panels, if you look at them, they're constructed as spatial structures with pattern wrapped around them.
Like in the second panel, the pattern on the foreground character's helmet, I mean, it's not functional, it's not even really decorative, it just gives you the idea of an alien character, or an alien, the alien place that the characters are in.
Although if you do start looking at circuit diagrams, they really do end up looking like Jack's stuff. And here's an unused cover from that time period, late Thor in the 60s.
And they didn't use this one. You can see there's space, and Thor is being attacked by this character in the middle ground, which is in space, and you see the city below. This was not used, I'm guessing, because it was too complicated for a cover. I think it was too much to take in.
Can you talk a little bit about Jack's relationship with Marvel at this point? What have you?
Jack had created just a ton of characters for Marvel, but he was only getting a page rate, and they owned everything and retained all rights. So he was getting a little frustrated because it was just not right.
The characters were becoming more popular, and in the mid-'60s they were doing television cartoons and starting to do merchandise and other things, and he got neither credit nor money for all of these incredible characters he created for the company. That's unlike any other creative effort.
After a while, he got tired of doing it. He's saying, why am I creating all this stuff and it's just going into their pockets? So he started holding back on a lot of new characters and just started using a lot of the old characters that he'd already created. So that's why you see a lot of, around 1967, 68, you start seeing a lot of repetitive characters coming in because he just didn't want to create and give them anything new.
And what was his relationship with Stan like? As Stan Lee, the guy who's in all the movies, is the creator of Marvel Comics.
Well, Jack, even though there was the Mighty Marvel bullpen, there really wasn't a Mighty Marvel bullpen. It was a very, very small office. It took up maybe half a floor in a building in New York, and most of the artists never came into the office. And that was Jack's case. He never worked at the Marvel offices. He always worked at home. And he would come in once a week to deliver his pages. He would see Stan and they would talk about whatever the next issues of whatever Jack was working on or projects. And then Jack would leave and go home and just work on the next books. So he really didn't have that much contact with Stan.
And this is where you can see the romance comics with Crystal in the foreground, and like just going for the big close-up.
Yeah, this sequence I think is really interesting because for Jack Kirby, the master of action, this is actually the Fantastic Four is almost a cross between a romance comic and a superhero comic because the characters were ostensibly a family. They were all part of a family unit, and you have them just talking and interacting here, and it's still very dramatic, but it's actually they do relate to each other, not like super beings, but people within a family unit. It's very unusual.
And so, by this point, how many did Jack have a family, and what was important to him?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, by this point he had 4 children, and let's see, which one is
This late Fantastic Four.
late. He was still living in New York. He hadn't moved out to California yet. He was just about to.
And we go from quiet domestic scenes to Okay, I'm gonna blow you
Fear
away,
section.
only the way you can in comic book pages.
Thousand Oaks, and Marvel had been sold. Martin Goodman, who had owned it since the beginning, sold out to a corporation, and they gave Stan Lee a contract, but they didn't give Jack a contract. And they tried to make a deal with him that he just didn't like. So he called Carmine Infantino, who is now running DC, and he had known Carmine back in the 50s. And Carmine's brother Jimmy Infantino had worked for Simon and Kirby, so he knew them well. And Carmine had said, sure, we'd be happy to have you at DC. So Carmine flew out to California, and Jack signed, I believe it was a five-year contract. And it allowed him to be the writer, the editor, the artist, just basically his own man, just turning out books.
And he started creating the New Gods.
The
This
Forever
is-
People.
This
Mr.
is
Miracle.
Darkseid, the side, sorry. I'm like going, is it side or seed? I can't remember, I don't remember, I'm spacing
side.
out. I'm jet lagged. It's my excuse for everything today. That's why we didn't have the right cables. This is the first page of the New Gods, which was the end of Thor and the Fantastic Four and all of them. And this is him going off to DC and starting his whole new universe. And you can see this brown, you see it on the projector, you can see it better on the projector. The brown strip, they cut the artwork apart and glued it,
The drawing wasn't drawn to the correct size for the page.
because they had to put in at the bottom, they had the contents that they had to, the credits, there was sort of like a strip of business bullshit that they stuck in at the bottom. This,
Oh.
talk about Jimmy Olsen,
Okay.
why he worked on Jimmy Olsen instead of anything else.
Right, well, no, along with everything else, Jack,
But this was his first book at DC, right? Jimmy Olsen?
they wanted him,
Yeah.
they wanted him to take over Superman, and he didn't want to take over Superman. He wanted to create his own characters, and he also didn't want to throw the artists that were already working on the book out of jobs, because his number one thing about being an artist is providing for his family. And he knows that the other cartoonists had families and things like that. He never wanted to replace any other artist on a book. He says, give me a book that doesn't already have an established team. And they said, well, there's Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. And Jack said, Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. Okay, I'll do it. And he took this very corny comic with Jimmy Olsen with his little bow tie and his little green sports coat, and the guy who would chase after Superman, hey, Soup! You know, and he turned him into this incredible action character and brought back a group of characters that Jack had created for DC in the early 40s, the Newsboy Legion, which is, you know, these are like kids from a tenement who sold newspapers and solved crimes. So by the 70s, that was like totally, you know, newsboys, whatever.
What are newsboys?
Yeah, well, these are the sons of the original Newsboy Legion. But all of a sudden, they have like, look at this. This is they were on adventure. This is like their car. It was called the
Whiz-Wagon.
The Whiz-Wagon. And it's the most incredible, I forget how they justified them having this souped up car. But look at this. Only Jack Kirby would create a car that he would have to draw over and over and over again with this kind of detail. I mean, it's insane. To do it as one drawing is one thing, but to have it as like an ongoing character in a strip was madness. And
The other thing is all of these ideas and characters and things that Jack created are now being used in like the new Justice League of America movies that are coming out. They're hinting that like Darkseid is in it. If you watch Supergirl, Project Cadmus is all based on Jack's idea of what was it called? Project X? or-
Cadmus.
yeah,
Yeah.
Okay, it was I think
Was
there
it
was.
Cadmus?
I don't
There's
think
a,
it was.
I
They
think
called
there's
it
a
something
character he created
Yeah.
called Cadmus. I
So a
think.
lot of what Jack did, you know, 40 years ago is now being all incorporated into the DC universe.
yeah. The
I
modern-
mean, Jerry Ordway did a whole run of Superman where he reused Jack's characters, the whole Newsboy Legion and that. all of those were did. I mean, basically, it's comics are now all done. Our generation of comics creators, sort of the 50-year-olds, the Mike Mignolas, the Jim Lees, we all grew up on Jack's work. And people get into the place where they can use Jack's work, and they use Jack's work in so many versions of it. It gets recycled over and over and over again.
Because they're still 40, 50 years later, they're visionary, futuristic, really viable and exciting concepts. And one thing about DC is that they do credit Jack with his creations, and did acknowledge his creation and pay royalties on the use of the characters. So we'll give DC a pat on the back for that.
This is actually, there's a splash page to this, which, why it's not in the show, I don't know.
It's all owned by AT&T.
But this is an example of Jack's sequences more than anything, where he's doing the fight scene where Isaiah is fighting, Steppenwolf is the bad guy. This is the punch that everybody wanted to do. Everybody keeps trying to draw a punch that dynamic. I've tried to swipe this panel a bunch of times. I've never been able to do it. And this is where Isaiah's wife gets killed, and Jack's using all the technique he's built up all over these years to crank out and do this. You can see this panel over and over again where there's a guy in Jack's work, where there's a little guy in the background making a punch, and the bad guys all come flying out at you. There's going to be a Fantastic Four artist edition that's going to use one of the Fantastic Four versions of that panel as the front piece and printed at 18 by 24. And I can't wait to see it. Here we have Darkseid lecturing the...
This is actually, I'm just going to stand up.
You gotta stand.
Something. This is very funny. He also threw a lot of humor in his comics. These are young, like, teenage heroes. They're called the Forever People. And Darkseid, the villain, has such authority, he starts to lecture them, and they're all standing. He's a stand at attention when I talk to you. And because he's older and, he's like, he has this gravitas, they're like standing there because they're teens, and this adult is yelling at them, and he's lecturing them, and he like goes up and tweaks one of the characters' noses, and he just treats them like nothing. I always thought this was an extraordinary moment. And look at that. I mean, this is like a superpowered guy grabbing your nose and turning it. And you can just look at that distortion. It's just I think it's just amazing. His villains are very Shakespearean. Is that they're the ones who are actually telling you what the story is about, and the heroes are actually
just sort of there.
And
the villain could have something to do.
Yes, right, exactly, right. I mean, they're actually not as important as the villain and what he has to say and what he does.
So Darkseid was the combination of Hitler and Nixon, right? Is that true? Did Jack ever talk about his politics at all?
Oh,
And
Jack was super liberal. But no, he never talked about Darkseid. Was really just the ultimate villain. He was just all-powerful, just wanted control over everything. Very Trump-like.
Oh, stop. Okay, here we...
We should. What time is this supposed to end?
At 12, and we have about less than 10 minutes, so we.
So we're gonna kind of crank on and get. I want to get to the collages.
Okay.
You can
Okay.
dump on Trump while you go.
No.
We get to the collages.
We're here to have fun.
This is after DC canceled the New Gods, and Jack created a bunch more characters. This is one called the Demon.
OMAC, the one-man army corps.
And here's where you see Jack's two-page spreads that he started in the 40s. Now they're just kind of blowing off the page.
We should also mention Mike Royer, who's the inker on all the DC books, because Jack, up until that time, whatever inker the publisher decided to ink his work, that's who inked it. But when Jack went to DC, they started with Vince Colletta, who had been inking him at Marvel, and Jack wasn't real happy with that. So Mike lived on the West Coast, and Jack met him, and he liked Mike's enthusiasm and everything. So he brought Mike on board to do all of his inking and lettering, and so Mike pretty much inked out most of Jack's work throughout his
Which
DC.
was great for Jack because he could keep control of the work. He would send DC back finished books. So all they had to do was print them.
This is the light show from the movie 2001. They did an adaptation of it. And this is the light show at the end of it. And this is Jack's version of it, done for comics before you could get the kind of printing that we have now.
But look at that. I mean, it's amazing.
Really just pencil shading almost.
Right, but you get that feeling of movement. If you recall the movie at the end where the astronaut is going, there's that
Zooming
light,
into, like,
famous light trip at the end of the movie. He captures that in black and white, which is amazing. The coloring didn't do it justice, but that thing has movement. Where are we? Oh, Commandy.
This is Commandy. This is he did some black and white magazines. This is called The Days of the Mob, where he got to retell some of the stories from that time period.
Okay, that's Commandy again. Which is kind of a turn on the Planet of the Apes, where the young human boy lives in a world where animals have evolved to human form, and he's the animal. So it is very Planet of the Apes in that way. Okay, what do you want to?
I want to, I'm just trying to get the.
Oh.
Here's Jack goofing off. This is Jack's entertainment. This was not done for any. That's what he was working on. That's half of the page. That's about 18 by 24. It's bigger than 18 by 24. And this is the other side of the work.
Incredible.
It's like 4 comic book pages.
This is what he do to relax.
It's Cubism meets modernism meets comics meets pop art meets everything. This is one of Jack's most Cubists. This was a gift to Don Heck for inking some pages.
Yeah, this is probably
Don
an
Heck's an old
extra
comic
page
book
for a
artist.
comic that I think it was.
I think it was just done as a gift for inking that portfolio.
I think it was both.
Okay, may have been both. All right, whatever. But as you can see, here's Jack drawing in the 60s. Here's on the left is Picasso drawing in 1910, basically doing the same graphic structure. Jack's doing the same graphic structure and playing with the same ideas as Picasso, was playing with the same ideas as an architect and printmaker named Piranesi from the 1800s. I think the 1700s or 1800s. My art history is long gone. And this is what I wanted to get to before we get to end.
Oh, Steve's mother. That's the back of her head.
And it's Steve's mom, the back of Steve's mom's head here. Through Jack's work, through all of the time, he was always throwing in these photographic collages where this is a Fantastic Four collage. That's from a book called Spirit World. The printing couldn't even handle it. So these things looked like shit.
They really did. Yeah.
Excuse the language when they got printed. They looked like this.
Yeah, they had.
And
they
you
couldn't
knew there
print
was
them
something-
in color, and they had to screen them, and they didn't. Yeah, they didn't have anywhere near the impact because the printing technology wasn't there.
I mean, as a fine artist, I got my degree in fine arts, and I always say, there's Picasso, Matisse, and then Jack for the 20th century as the 3 greatest artists of that time period. And Jack was doing the one thing that neither of those guys did was making narratives, but he was using all the same techniques that Matisse did and that Picasso did, is using collage as a way to tell a story and break down these images and do this fractured stuff. And artists even today with Photoshop are still catching up to Jack Kirby 50 years
As
later.
opposed to Jack and his glue stick and his scissors and a pile of old Life magazines.
Right.
I mean, look what you can do with. I mean, honest to gosh, that's incredible.
And here we have, in the middle of this is the whiz wagon. That's Jack just taking some cars and cutting them up into pieces and turning it into the whiz wagon and making it into something. So you can see that all of this is just like, I'm going to blow your mind in any way I could. And this is a guy who was doing it at a level, I think is, I think that,
It's later.
I think that might be, sorry, that might be from 2001.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
And the thing of it is, when computers started coming in, I had one of the earliest Amiga graphic computers, and I went to Jack and I said, "You got to try this. This is great, because you can like scan things and move them around." By that time, he was in his mid 60s, and he was his health wasn't great. He said, "Nah, I just don't want to bother with it. It's like it's interesting, but I'm done." Finished.
This is definitely 2001.
Yes. Yeah. Unbelievable.
That's just unbelievable, and I don't know why it's sequenced this way, but I goofed. So he had a period, he went back to Marvel, created Devil Dinosaur.
Oh, that's really interesting because you can. Is that Jack hand colored that?
No,
spread?
that's from the book. That's
Is it
coloring
from
from
the
the book, yes.
Okay.
That's just
It looks like that's the kind of coloring that Jack liked, real
bright
pow.
colors.
Yeah.
And this is the Angel of Death from Silver Star. Does a butt shot for the Angel of Death.
Yeah.
He
He
actually
actually
work
makes
on the art, the inking on the wings.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's
And-
like the biblical character of the angel of death.
If you can, there's a Silver Star pencil edition. If you can find a pencil version of this, it's even more impressive than this drawing. I like the Royer inks, but it just is like, I'm going to make this the most emotional, powerful drawing I can find. And that's the Jack Kirby show, because he was the best artist, one of the three best
He's
artists
our
of the last
favorite.
century.
Any questions? We have just a minute or so before we got to get out of here.
Anything you
Okay.
want to know?
I think just actually real quick, as someone who grew up on comics from the 70s and 80s and even some of the older stuff, I'm not going to say my age, but we'll say I was around. I was a kid when those came out. I noticed that there was like this heroism, and like you could tell what black and white is in modern comics. Not all of them, but a lot of them. It's more dark. There's more of a, not as much of a line. Can you talk a little bit, maybe, kind of how you guys feel about kind of more modern stuff, or how it's changed a little bit?
I think that I'm a fairly idealistic person when you get past the cynical nastiness. And I think a lot of that's a reflection of the difference between growing up in the 40s and having to go fight a war and really deal with the Great Depression and needing some optimism to get through that, over our generation, which, we didn't have to go fight in the war in Vietnam. I mean, I was too young to fight, but a lot of people got out of it and dodged the draft in a lot of ways. And so there's this sort of pseudo-sophistication of I'll be cool and I'll take on this thing for comics today, where we don't have to really deal with like real-life issues of fighting a war or having someone really evil and bad to confront, So I think it's a lot of people who, when I was working at Marvel and DC, wanted to be, quote, adult. And we would often try to do sophisticated things and try to be adult. And I think there's something to being adult where you can just be honest, and if you can do honest work, that's actually more adult than trying to be sophisticated.
Right. Well, a lot of people confuse being adult and sophisticated to being violent and nihilist and depressing, as opposed to being honest and worldly and have something interesting to say. Which
Yeah.
That's Jack, as opposed to that, in my opinion.
I mean, I was depressed in my 20s too, but I don't really feel like revisiting and saying that I had anything valuable to contribute to you about being depressed in the 20s and how you get out of that, And I think, like, Jack had something that he really, in his 20s, he was frigging fighting Hitler. And I think that drives a lot of, like, what he saw as, how to take life forward if you're going to be really, positive.
Right. Back when cartoonists drew their influences from life, as opposed to a lot of cartoonists now who get their influences from other comics.